forgot to hit record, so I'll just start over here.
Yep.
So I'm here talking with Shari, and the idea was to talk about writing poetry and what that experience is like. So I know Shari has been writing for quite a long time. And for me, it's a little more recently that I started writing poetry. So I thought it would be interesting to talk a bit about what it's like and what we get out of it. Perhaps some of the what goes on in the process of writing. So I know in the recent video Shari did with Jeff, they talked about some of C.S. Lewis's poetry, and she told a little bit about how, like, just how her poetry began early on in her childhood. So I thought maybe, Shari, you could just reiterate kind of your story, where you found that book of poetry.
Well, you mean my Robert Frost story?
Yeah, I thought that was a good story.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I was in grade 1, and the teacher had given us the task of writing a story for the first time. And I mean, I remember this occasion very clearly, but I don't know at what point in grade 1 it was in. But obviously we had some ability to write. She had taught us enough words that we could put together a basic narrative. And of course I had to go outside the box. So my story had bigger words in it than I knew. So I remember having to go and ask her almost every word that I wrote, which was, she was patient. She was great. And then I wrote this little story. I don't know, maybe it was like 3 sentences long, whatever, about a prince and a princess. And the reward for having completed the story was, the first person to do it was that she would take them to the library. That was our pass to the library. So, and it was a small school in rural Southern Ontario, mostly farm kids actually. And I'm pretty sure that
I think we're losing you here for a second. Not sure what's going on.
A bigger, like, can you hear me?
Oh, yeah, you're back now.
Oh, did I freeze? Where did I freeze?
Just after, I think, when you're going to pick up the book by Robert Frost.
Yeah, so anyway, she said that I could choose any book I wanted from the library, and I remember taking my time and I pulled out 101 poems by Robert Frost. And I took it home, I lent it out, I signed my name on the card, all that stuff. And I read it to the best of my ability. I do remember being very impressed by the poem by Robert Frost of the 2 roads diverged in yellow wood. That poem was, I think, probably the most understandable for me at that point in my life. And it kind of became a mantra actually for me in later years. Like it was the poem that set my one foot in front of the other. And yeah, and that's kind of where my love for words and poetry came from. Although I have to say that I was always either in my head or verbally composing songs and poems from a very, very young age. So yeah, it was speaking to
You seem to be cutting out.
I know. There. My internet is a little choppy. Wait a minute, let me see if I can find a different spot. Is this any better?
It seems better right now, but it's just every once in a while it was cutting out after a couple minutes.
Right.
So I guess I'll just kind of tell how I got started with poetry. So my story is quite a bit different because I didn't really start writing until about last year. And it kind of just happened in some sense. I had written some other stuff, some essays, and I found that was something that I enjoyed doing. So, and then I tried to write a novel just to see if that would be something I could do. And I found that writing a novel wasn't really the best medium for me. I felt like I was writing a whole lot and not getting into the ideas that I was interested in. Or you talked a little bit about poetry getting underneath things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's more what I like to try and do. And I felt like the lengthier approach of a novel didn't really suit me for some reason. When I grew up, mostly I was more not really into verbal things and writing. I was more, I was better at things like math and science. But I think one thing that kind of pushed me toward poetry was the idea of patterns. I found that I was always pretty good at patterns.
Yeah.
On things here and there. I've always been a bit more of kind of an introverted person, so that also seemed to lend itself to poetry because sometimes I kind of got lost in my head or in my imagination, and it's really something I was exploring at that time in my life. But this kind of opened it up for me, and I've really enjoyed doing. There's a few times over the summer where me and my family went out. Where we have a small house out by a lake that's nearby. So for a couple of weeks, I took a few breaks from writing. But I found after the end of that, I was really looking forward to start writing again. So
Mm-hmm.
it seems to be something that's stuck with me.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good sign. When you feel like it's like a dump, like you can take the things that you're processing in your head and you can put it down. I'm curious to know if when you write poetry, do you suddenly see something more clearly, or even something that you didn't know about yourself after it's written down?
I'm not sure if I've experienced exactly that, but something similar where I start writing something and it's a few lines and I'm not really sure where it's going. But then after a while, you say, "Oh, I see where that was going and how that connects to me, or the things that I've been thinking about." And
Yeah.
sometimes it's kind of a surprise, even to yourself as you're writing it. So I've experienced that thing fairly often.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I was talking to, I think it was in my conversation with Jeff that I mentioned that poetry it's this completely other language. And I don't know enough. I'm sure that there's, you know, books written on the subject. I should actually try to find one because I do have enough curiosity about it, but it's a language unto itself. You know, it's and a way of expressing oneself that is completely other than prose or conversation, dialogue, even monologue, you know. And it comes from a very deep place, and I would like to know more. I bet, well, I'm sure Owen Barfield has something to say about it. I haven't read much of Owen Barfield, but I'm sure he would have something to say about that. So yeah, that's fascinating to me because I think it's in a way, it's revelation poetry. It's revelation, even it's revelation to the reader, and it's revelation to the poet, you know, to the person who's writing it. And I find that's without sounding too religious, it seems almost divine, you know. I don't want to say supernatural because that's too reductionist, but it just seems like it comes from a different place.
Yeah, lately I've been thinking, well, recently, that it's almost is like a religious practice, kind of like a prayer or meditation when you're writing. And I have noticed that kind of changed the way that I start looking at other things in my life. Start to starting to notice more just in everyday conversation the kind of poetic language that pops out here and there, just non-ordinary people.
I didn't quite get that, Nolan. Can you repeat that last sentence?
Well, I've noticed that in everyday conversation that I'm listening to, I'll pick up on poetic language
Yeah.
that appears while people are talking.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like, you know, I've said this before, I have lots of animals and I'm very observant with my animals. I love watching them, and I watch them because they have their own language, and their language is expressed in mostly through their bodies. They do have vocalizations, but their body language is so subtle, and it says everything to them, and they read it really well. And if you start to observe it long enough, you can read it too, and you can practice it. And this might sound really weird, but I've put it into practice that if you practice their body language with them, they understand what you're saying. And then you've opened a door of communication that didn't previously exist because you're speaking the same language. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Okay. And poetry is kind of like that. Like the change that you're finding in everyday conversation, and it's seeing the subtle inflection of a word, or the underlying tone, or the context of the action, right? Because everything has a context, and And then it starts to become, it's hard to describe. Maybe you should try to describe that.
Well, building off your idea of poetry as a language, well, it's kind of like learning a new language, and you start um, being able to understand different parts of your life
Mm-hmm.
in a more broad and expansive way than before you knew that language.
Yeah, and you're putting yourself into settings. Like you're kind of getting a different perspective on who you are, you know. And I remember a very smart man, he was a psychologist actually, he said to me one time, he said, you know, imagine the personality of, like, your personality, for example, like a diamond, a cut diamond. It has all these facets, right? All these little facets. And from where you're standing or I'm standing looking at my personality or who I am, I can only see so many of those facets. But people who stand around me can see, if they're in front of me, they can see the facets in the front. If they're behind me, they can see the facets in the back. And to put it in simple, plain language, facets are faces. And they're the faces that we wear in all the different interactions that we have in the world. And when you think poetically, or you're writing a poem and you're in the midst of it, you're actually removing yourself from yourself in a sense, and you're able to put yourself in the setting and see yourself in that setting. And perhaps I'm just freewheeling here, that's the insight that you get when you've read the poem, is that you've had the opportunity to see the other faces of yourself. It's just a thought.
Yeah, I think there's someone, I don't remember who said it, but Peterson mentioned it a few times, that you can't really think without writing.
Yeah.
And that reminds me of what you were talking about.
Yeah, you're processing.
Yeah, it gives you a certain amount of distance from your immediate experience, where you can kind of step back a little bit and look at the experience or what was involved with the poem from a different perspective.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So, and you found that it's changing you. So you're being more observant in everyday life, obviously. But is it changing you on the inside, do you think?
It's hard to say for sure, but mostly it's been that I've been a bit more perceptive. And like I mentioned before, I would pick up on some things that I hear when people are talking, but also certain images across your my mind more.
I missed the last part, just the last part.
It was that
You're in your mind more?
no, like when I'm just going through my life, I see certain images and they kind of stick in my head, these
Okay.
images, and then I usually write something about them.
Yeah.
So it's been more noticing small things that I probably wouldn't have noticed before.
Yeah. And that's what poetry is, imagery too, right? So you're starting to think in poetic terms, you know, you're thinking in images.
Yeah. another thing that when I look back, I've been pretty good visually, actually, and did a bit of visual art earlier in my life. So looking back, it makes sense. I started writing poetry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because before that, I felt like I was jumping from one thing to the next, trying all these different things, but it was kind of a bit of a chaotic time for me, and I wasn't sure what I should be doing or how I should be spending my time.
Yeah.
And looking back, it's kind of back. I can see how the path that I was on took me to here. But during that time, I wasn't sure what I was going to be doing. I felt like I needed to find some type of something to for myself to, rather than jumping from one thing to the next, realizing that that wasn't the right thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in the end, it kind of came full circle. And I can see how the other things that I tried are actually useful in writing poetry that I've been doing now. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you have to, you got to dip your toe in several pools to find out which one is the best one to swim in, right? and and I don't think that anything is for nothing. Everything happens for a reason, and even if that reason is just to make us into the person who we are today. And we are the sum total of our experiences, really. And hopefully that, we're lucky, we're one of the lucky ones, and that makes us a better person. And I'm happy to hear that, you're finding a deep personal satisfaction in writing poetry, because I think poetry is, well, I think it's beautiful, for one thing. I think it's a beautiful form of imagery and language. But I also think it's really therapeutic. It really helps us to process our thoughts and relieve perhaps pressures that we build up in our heads, yeah, I just think that if it's something that you're comfortable with doing, that it's going to be beneficial, in the end, it's going to be good.
yeah, that kind of reminds me of past authoring program that Jordan Peterson has.
Yeah.
Where it's about writing about the, your past and the things you've experienced. In particular, focusing on memories
Focusing on what?
on memories that have like an emotional affect.
Right.
And I went through that program a while ago and found it helpful to look back on past experiences, to write about and really kind of examine them from that different perspective.
Yeah.
That some of them start certain like keys that you see in there or important things that you need to learn in some sense going forwards. And that's kind of keep re-entering your mind and affecting you in some way, because they've been fully processed and they're still.
Yeah. Do you think that going through that program kind of launched you into writing poetry?
I'm not, I wouldn't say directly that it did. It might have.
Mm-hmm.
I found it helpful though, because most of the memories that were bothering me before don't seem to bother me anymore.
That's great. That's awesome. Well, you know, poetry is contemplative too, right? Like you were saying, meditative, and that's kind of when you look back on your life and you think through things, and look at different memories. You almost need a poetic language to understand them, you know, because a lot of, I mean, memories are images, and so yeah, that's really great.
Yeah, in other ways it can help you. It's kind of interesting to transform something that was traumatic to you into something that's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And then in some sense I'm not sure what I'm trying to say, but it kind of, again, it gives you a different perspective on the thing.
Yeah, no, that you put that perfectly well, you know, transforming something that could have been traumatic or was traumatic into something beautiful. That is often what you do with poetry. And, you know, you work through pain, right? Oftentimes. And that's really well put. And that is transformative in and of itself, because now you've seen the thing from a different perspective, like you said. Yeah. And that would be the reason why those things don't bother you as much anymore, because you understand them differently now. That's great.
Yeah. And you can kind of see from it, if you look at things from the Christian perspective, it's kind of, if you look at yourself and your life and the transformations that you go through, it would be a similar thing, but at a higher level.
It would be what?
It's similar to transforming something traumatic into a poem, but it's at like a scale of operation than that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's a really good analogy. Giving it that heavenly language, right? For lack of a better word.
Yeah. So I think in your conversation with Jeff, you talked a little bit about kind of what you think poetry is. So I was thinking, I have a few ideas about maybe kind of reiterate some of the things that you think poetry is. So,
Okay. Did you want me to reiterate it, or are you going to?
maybe you should just kind of reiterate what you were thinking about it.
Was now I'm like grappling to remember what I said. Was it about getting underneath the thing?
That was part of it, and then kind of that it's kind of a concentration of.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So taking a large concept, and I don't even like to use the word condense, because actually sometimes what it does is it opens it up even larger, right? But it's taking a big concept and just using language in such a way that you can take the treasure out of it. You know, you can take the gems from it, from that concept, and you can bring them up to the surface and let people see them. I don't know if that's a very clear explanation, but that's how I see poetry. It's clear, concise, not even like I hate using, you know, scientific terminology or clear-cut sterile words to describe it, the process, because it's so much more than that. But yeah, I guess it's just taking a large idea and packing it into a few words that bring out that idea in such a way that so what you're doing is you want the person to look at that idea from a certain angle. You want them to see something in that idea that you're seeing. And so that's kind of what it is. Might not be the whole idea, but it might be what you're seeing in that concept. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think the way I look at it could add to what you were saying there. So Peterson talks a lot about meaning, the meaning in life and those kinds of things. So I was thinking about meaning with regards to poetry. And I think a way to describe it is kind of a concentration of meaning, where it's not just like the meaning of the words that you would find in the dictionary, but it's you're trying to reiterate or strengthen that same meaning through the way that you arrange the words together and the rhythms that they create, and sometimes even what the poem itself looks like.
Yeah.
And so you got all these different levels of meaning, most of which we kind of, in more straightforward or technical writing, we kind of avoid that kind of stuff, or we aren't paying attention to what the words sound like and how they're put together as much as when we're reading poetry. So I think it's trying to get all these different meanings and stuff up together, which I think kind of fits with what you were saying about poets trying to get people to look at it a certain way.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple of thoughts come to mind when when you talk about it that way. One of them is you've been following John Vervaeke's lectures too, right?
Yeah, I haven't watched the recent ones, but I've watched most.
I haven't had time. But the whole idea of the different ways of knowing things, right? The participatory, the perspectival, remind me of the other two. They're P words too. Anyway.
Yeah, participatory, I think.
Yeah, participatory, perspectival, and then two others. Maybe I'll think of them later on in the conversation. But when you were talking about the form, poetry has form. Poetry has the use of words. Like you can accentuate things. Like I have one poem that I have one line in it that says, "It's the twist and the twist and the twist," right? In other words, it's an over twist, and it's an overuse of the word twist at the same time. And so you have you've got all these ways of knowing the thing all wrapped up into one bit of text, and that expands the knowledge that you're acquiring from it. That expands I would even say that expands it out into a form of wisdom, right? It
Yeah,
strikes you as being something wise that somebody has said. Oh, that's smart. That's a good way of seeing that. That's wise, you know. And yeah, I'm just realizing this after you said that, because that's true. You're not just using words, you're using form, and you're also working outside of the box, right? You're not staying within the parameters of, you know, what's the right way. I personally hate rules. So poetry gives me that freedom as well, right? I don't have to follow any rules. I can go with how what's happening while I'm writing it, so I can convey that to the reader.
yeah, yeah. I think some of the I've tried writing a few sonnets, and I felt like I didn't really write anything good when I was trying to maintain the form. But
Mm.
I usually, well, like I was saying before, and like if you bring the if you bring the vocabulary that Vervaeke uses, you're kind of trying to get all these levels of knowledge and all the ways of knowing kind of stacked up, and so that they mutually reinforce each other.
Mm-hmm.
And when I usually try, or when I'm thinking about when I have something, maybe a first draft of a poem, um, I forgot what I was going to say, but yeah,
Well, you were talking about the stacking up of ways of knowing things and how they are mutually strengthening each other. And then you were saying that, you know, you were in the when you're in the process of drafting up a poem, or the first draft of a poem.
yeah, now I remember. So it usually ends up having some type of form, and you might not pick it up at first, but the way I like to think about it is that you're trying to get the form to strengthen the poem itself, so that, and it might be the case that certain kind of traditional forms are good at making a poem work a certain way, but when you're writing your own poetry, it might not necessarily well with that form. The like if the form is out of alignment with the other levels of the poem.
Yeah.
So
Well, you know, I think that, okay, so I know that, you know, you can take poetry writing courses, and then you can find out all about the different forms and ways, you know, of writing poetry. I've never done that. And I can make an analogy. So when I moved to Switzerland, I didn't speak any German. I had no concept of, I actually thought Switzerland had a coastline. That's how naive I was. and and so in Switzerland, they don't speak German, they speak Swiss German, and it's not a written language. So you can't study it to learn it. It's not written down. The children learn High German in school, because that's the written form of German. And so my husband suggested I take a German course. And I went to the German course, and in that German course, there were a number of women who had married Swiss men. Many of them were from England, and they wanted to learn German so that they could, you know, fit in. And some of them had been in Switzerland for many, many years, and had been taking German courses for that number of years. And when they spoke German, they spoke High German mixed with Swiss German, because they're learning German and they're living Swiss German, okay? So when they opened their mouths, they sounded ridiculous. They sounded uneducated, foolish, you know, really dumb, right? And I left that course and I said to my husband, I'm not doing that, because if I put that information in there, it's gonna be in there, and then I'm gonna struggle with it. So I'm just gonna learn Swiss, and I'm gonna have to listen and watch and learn. And that's what I did. It was a trade-off. I sacrificed being able to read it. I can read German, but I can't write it. And I have difficulty speaking it. But I fit in perfectly into the culture that I lived in. And language, okay? Language is like it's more than a window into a culture. Because when you understand the vocabulary that people use, where it comes from, when to use it, you suddenly understand the culture, right? And so I think that I don't want to sound too esoteric or anything, because I'm not that way, but I think that people have songs, okay? They have songs inside of them. And that melody comes out in the way they speak. So if you watch a movie from the 1950s, the way that they talk to each other sounds strange to us. Even the way, the tone, you know, the words, the excitement, where they placed the emphasis, it all sounds a little hokey, right? But that's the song that they were singing in the 1950s. And we sing a different song today. And when Elizabeth Barrett Browning was writing sonnets, she was also singing a different song, right? I'm not saying that you can't write sonnets, but what I'm saying is that you have to somehow change the tune that's happening inside of you when you do write a sonnet. So you almost have to put yourself in that song, in that place, in that time in history. And then when you write a sonnet, it will be a sonnet, because the sonnet is the song of the age to me.
Yeah.
Poetry that we write is, oh, you froze. Are you there?
Yeah, it's back now. Yeah, I think that, well, I think when we're writing sonnets today, we can't participate with the form in the same way that the people writing it in the past could, because um, our environment is just a lot different in many ways.
Yeah.
But usually, when I was talking about form a little bit earlier, I more so meant that sometimes I write a poem and some type of form that isn't necessarily one of the traditional forms usually comes out in some way.
Mm-hmm.
Like it will be organized in a certain way, or there will be some type of repetition. It will have some type of form that kind of fits with what you're trying to do with the rest of the poem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes, when you first write a poem, it's almost like you made a stick man, right? And
Yeah.
and your form is like, you need to flesh it out, right? And you can flesh out the form too. Like, you don't have to just flesh out the idea. You can actually flesh out your form to give more oomph, to your idea or to your words.
Yeah, and when you were talking about the other women that were learning this, like learning the German in a classroom, it reminded me of what we were talking about earlier with these different forms of knowing. And so they had the propositional knowing about German, but the language that they were trying to participate in was um, out of alignment with what they knew propositionally. So
yeah, really,
it would sound disjointed and out of place because those levels are misaligned.
that's right. Yeah, that's a good observation. That's really good. Yeah, yeah. And then it made them seem foolish, although they weren't, right? Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. That's a good one. I like it.
So,
you know, back to that idea about song. When we moved to Switzerland, my daughter was 3 years old, and my husband's godmother was a special ed teacher. And okay, so my 3-year-old daughter is suddenly immersed into this whole different culture and different language. And she used to go to the fence of our yard, and when people would walk by, she would yell, "Hoi!" That's a Swiss word for hi, right? Hoi, hoi! And she didn't really speak Swiss. Like, she actually didn't speak it. And then people would come over because they would immediately, you know, oh, there's a little Swiss girl saying hello to me, right? They know what hoi means. And so she could entice them in with this word. And then they would get to the fence and she would start to talk to them. And she had completely mastered the musical lilt, the sound, the song of Swiss German. But none of her words made any sense, okay? She wasn't using any real vocabulary. And you would watch these people's faces and they would lean in, you know, to this little girl and they'd say, hello, you know, and then she would start talking to them and they would just, their faces would be like contorted because they could hear the song, they could hear the lilt, they could hear everything around the language, but there was no language there, right? And my husband's godmother said to me, you need to record that because that is like, children learn language from a small age, right? They're not plunked in at the age of 3 and have to work it out. And she has somehow learned all language is a song. It has a music to it, you know, and one can imitate. That's why, you know, someone can just say mumbo jumbo in an Italian accent and we think they're speaking Italian because it's a song first, right? And then it's vocabulary. And yeah, so I just thought of that example. I just wanted to share that with you, you know, in relationship to that idea.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of some of the more modern poetry. Certain strains of it are just more about creating a sound rather than um, including any type of semantic meaning. Which, so that reminded me that they have this music to it, but when you try to understand it in terms of propositions, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, because you have to look at it in a holistic way, right? You have to, that's those levels of knowing again, right? In it. Yeah. So fascinating.
And also, that story you were telling about the women learning German kind of reminds me of poetry in the sense that I know a lot of people, and I was like that before, didn't really understand what poetry was about, or it seemed in a lot of ways inaccessible or pretentious.
Mm-hmm.
But I found that after writing some poetry myself, kind of entering that participatory level,
Yeah.
then I started to understand poetry in general and how it operated. And that gave me a lot more appreciation and understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, and do you think that because poetry requires participatory knowing, would you say that you feel like you are more participating with life?
I think, yeah, I think you could say that.
Yeah, that would kind of harken back to what you were saying before about being more aware of poetic, I don't remember the word you used, but poetic nuances that are happening in conversation, and undertones and all those little things, right? You're more you're in a more participatory state of mode of being,
Yeah, I think that's right because it's like the language that I hear and the images that I see are participating in my life through writing poetry in a way that they weren't before.
Yeah,
So it's Vervaeke would, I guess, say that my salience landscape was changed
of course. Yeah.
because things that didn't stick out or weren't salient before have started to become salient now that I've started writing poetry. Uh,
Yeah,
is it working?
right. And become salient because you're writing poetry. They become salient because you're participating. You've it's kind of what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? Like you've been writing the poetry, but participatory, I think.
Yeah. Uh, you have froze for a little bit there. Is it still working? Hmm.
Oh, is it good? Is it okay now? Am I frozen? Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me? See you and I hear you.
Oh,
Can you see me?
I think you're frozen. Oh, there. Now it's back.
It's back. Sorry.
But yeah,
I can still see. I don't know
I
what's
think
happening.
it's kind of lagging behind a little bit. It seems like.
Do you have satellite internet?
I think. Do I don't think so. I'm not sure. We just got satellite TV, but I don't think we have satellite internet.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's really great to hear how that's working out for you. I think anything that draws you into a participatory state is going to be revivifying, you know, it's going to make you feel more alive, right? And that's always a good thing.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if there's anything else you want to talk about. I feel like I went
Yeah,
through most of it.
yeah, we can end it here. I don't know if I just went, when I drove out to Edmonton, I downloaded a bunch of podcasts. They're just short little 2-minute clips. I can send you the link, actually. Maybe that's what I'll do. It's called Intro to Poetry. And it's just read like that. Some of the poems have a little historical introduction as to the writing of the poem. And then it's read, and they're read really well. And when a poem is read well, it's great. So, and I just kind of immersed myself in that for, like, I just played one clip after another for a good hour of poetry. And I think you would enjoy that. So I'm going to send you the clip for that.
Okay.
Or the link. I mean. Yeah, I'll send you the link.
I've been listening to a few audiobooks of poetry. So I find that it's a lot better if someone reads it.
Yeah, reads it well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll do that, and it's been really nice to talk.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too.
Yeah. All right. You have a good day, Nolan.
See how some of the video, what it looks like after we finish.
Yeah, fine with me if you want to post it. That's no problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just take a look at it.
Sure. We had a few little technical glitches, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, you take care.
Yeah, you too.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.